All right. Lastly, on the topic of histology, I want to talk about nervous and muscle tissue. And again, before I start talking about these, I said this at the beginning of every presentation. I want to say it again. Go to this website and take a look at the images that have been taken of these tissues, just because, again, they are very good, clear images, and all these characteristics of these tissues that I'm talking about, you can go in here and actually see them, and again, see more pictures than what I'm showing you. So again, I strongly encourage you folks to visit this site. All right, now, basically the last topic I want to talk about, nervous and muscle tissue. I'm not going to go in extreme depth with these, just because later on we'll talk more about them when we talk about action potentials, muscle contractions, and so on. All right, but nervous and muscle tissue, we would call these tissues the excitable tissues of the body. Okay, the excitable tissues of the body, because these are the cells that comprise these tissues, like any other cell in the body, have a resting membrane potential. Okay, remember, any electrical charge. All right, but these are cells that change and that alter their membrane potential to carry out their specific functions. Okay, like a nerve generating an action potential or an electrical impulse, or a muscle manipulating its membrane potential so it can perform a contraction and movement can take place. All right, so basically what we're saying here, these are excitable tissues. We can irritate these tissues, they can change their electrical charge, and then they can carry out their job. So keep that in the back of your mind, not just when I'm talking about these, but as once we get into these chapters that are specific to this as well. The nervous and muscle tissue are excitable tissues. All right, and nervous tissue is the first tissue I'm going to talk about. Again, not going to go in extreme depth with this, just because in a couple of weeks we're going to be jumping into the nervous system, and I'll be talking a lot about this with more depth. All right, but definitely for now, you need to know and understand that nervous tissue is comprised of two different types of cells, neurons and glial cells. All right. Neurons are the actual functional cells. So these are the cells that you think of as generating electrical impulses and squirting out neurotransmitters. All right, and then glial cells, these are the support cells of the nervous system, especially of the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. Okay, the word glial means glue. Okay, the word glial means glue, all right? And within the central nervous system, remember when I say central nervous system, I mean within the brain and spinal cord, there is no connective tissue, all right? There's no connective tissue within the central nervous system. Instead, the space is occupied by glial cells, and that helps to add some kind of adherence and organization to the neurons and the makeup of the central nervous system, all right? So bear that in mind, that glial cells are primarily found within the CNS, the brain and the spinal cord. All right, there are glial cells associated with the peripheral nervous system, your peripheral nerves and ganglion as well. All right, but that's where you primarily find these. Okay. So, and typically what you find, within the peripheral nerves, let's say you look at a nerve and you see all the axons of nerves, you'll find a lot of that areolar connective tissue that I mentioned earlier, kind of gluing and sticking all these nerves together, and then there will be a blood vessel in there, and so on. All right. So depending on whether you're looking at the peripheral or central nervous system, there will be different tissues associated with it. With the central nervous system, glial cells gluing organizing the central nervous system, and then you see a lot of areolar connective tissue out in the periphery. All right. So when we take a look at nervous tissue, I mean, basically, the nervous system is comprised of this. Your brain, your spinal cord, and your peripheral nerves that branch out from the brain and spinal cord, whether it's your cranial or spinal nerves. All right. And then what you see here, these cells here would be the neurons. Okay. And then neurons are essentially broken down into two functional parts. They have a cell body, or what we would call a soma. All right, and then they have these long extending axons. Okay, these axons. So essentially, basically the way neurons work is their cell bodies, are responsible for producing and maintaining all aspects of the cell. These are where the proteins are synthesized for the cell to function. And then what happens is we generate electrical impulses, or what are called action potentials, down the length of these axons. And then the very ends of these axons, there are going to be these little buds, or these button-like looking structures that store neurotransmitters. So when that electrical signal gets down to these little buttons, then neurotransmitters are released, and then neurotransmitters are chemical messages, and then this is how nerves communicate with one another. A neurotransmitter may bind to another nerve and increase or decrease its activity. A neurotransmitter may communicate with a muscle and stimulate it to contract. I mean, there's a lot of different there are different neurotransmitters that have different functions, but that's essentially what neurons do. They communicate and they regulate all activity of the body. All right, and then you can see around here, the glial cells, okay, of nervous tissue, all the support cells. And there's a lot of different glial cells. But like I said, when we get to the actual chapter on nervous tissue, I'll talk more in depth about glial cells, all right? So essentially, that's what you really need to know about this, neurons and glial cells and neurons. And here's a representation of a motor neuron in the spinal cord, what we would call the ventral aspect of the ventral horn of the spinal cord. So again, neurons, I mentioned before in the last lecture about connective tissue that adipose tissue is extremely easy to identify just because you look at it. It's like looking at a bunch of ping pong balls under a microscope. Nervous tissue is also very easy to identify because neurons are very distinct looking cells. All right, neurons have these big, these large cell bodies, okay, with the nuclei. Not every neuron looks exactly like this, bear in mind, okay, but you will see these very distinct looking cell bodies, and depending on how thick the axons are, you may see the axons projecting out, you may not, okay, depending on where in the nervous system you're looking at, but you'll be able to spot a neuron pretty easily. And then there's just all the, the gluing glial cells around there. Okay, so again, here's some more, neurons. You can tell, okay, which would be the glial cells, which would be the neurons. Again, the neurons look very, very distinct in this tissue. Okay, so keep that in mind. When we say, again, ventral horn, when you look at a spinal nerve, I'll show you the anatomy of that later on. Okay, the anatomy of a spinal nerve, essentially, the ventral, or the front aspect of the nerve, is responsible for generating motor impulses, or think of it as a nerve going to a muscle, making it contract. Okay, and then information enters the dorsal, or the backside of the spinal cord, that's sensory information. Okay, so these would be neurons that are responsible for basically communicating with your peripheral tissues of the body. All right. So again, neurons and glial cells, that's nervous tissue. And again, this is an excitable tissue. These neurons that you can see here, these are cells that, again, you can excite. That's what, that we can excite, and then they can generate an action potential, an electrical impulse, release a neurotransmitter, and then some kind of response will be carried out from there. All right, so that's really about as much as I want to talk about nervous tissue for the sake of this histology topic. Again, it's an excitable tissue. It's comprised of neurons and glial cells. All right, and you should know that it's found within the brain, the spinal cord, and peripheral nerves. All right, and then the last topic I want to focus on here with the nervous tissue is, or I'm sorry, with histology, is the muscle tissue of the body. All right, and essentially muscles are another type of excitable tissue. These are tissues that in response to some kind of a stimulus can alter their electrical charge, their membrane potential, and then they carry out their job. Muscles are designed to contract. Okay, so when we say a muscle contracts, muscle tissue is designed to shorten. Okay, and shorten for the purpose of movement. That is the primary job of muscle tissue, to generate force for movement. All right, but there are three different histologic types of muscle tissue in the body. Now, all three types of muscle, all three types contract, and all three types generate movement, but movement of different sorts. Okay, and I'll talk about those three histologic types separately in a bit. All right, and the movements that can be created, a skeletal muscle will, these are, we say skeletal muscle because these are muscles attached to bones to move limbs. All right, we can use muscle to help us circulate blood, like cardiac muscle tissue. We can use muscle to help us expel urine, like smooth muscle, okay, or control blood flow, smooth muscle. All right, and then, muscle being that it is, in order for muscle to be continuously contracting, okay, it requires a lot of energy. You have to burn a lot of calories in order to do this, to maintain the activity of muscle tissue on a day-to-day basis. So as a result, because of all the metabolism and chemical reactions of muscle tissue, it's very good at generating heat. Okay, now remember, muscle is a very poor insulator, but it's very good at generating heat. All right. And as I just mentioned, there are three types of muscle you're going to find in the body: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. All right, and again, just as I've been mentioning before, when you're trying to differentiate between similar classes of tissue, you have to look at the characteristics of the tissue. You have to look at the cellular composition. What do the cells look like? How much space is there in between the cells? You have to look at the extracellular matrix. Okay, is it a very tough? Is it very watery? Is it, like a glue? So on. All right, and that's how we'll differentiate between these three classes of muscle, by looking at those characteristics. All right, the first one we'll talk about is skeletal muscle. All right, skeletal muscle. When people typically just say the word muscle, that's what people are typically referring to. They're saying, the muscles that are attached to your skeleton to make movement take place. All right, that's the muscle tissue you eat. All right, if you want to eat a steak, if you want to, if you kill a deer, you want to eat the venison out of that deer, you're eating skeletal muscle tissue, which is a great source of protein. All right, but now, some characteristics about skeletal muscle. Remember, we call it skeletal because this is the muscle tissue that's attached to our skeleton. This is the muscle tissue that moves our limbs. This is the muscle tissue I'm using right now to speak to you. It's the muscle tissue I'm using right now to write, to just, do crazy things with the marker. All right. So some properties you need to understand about skeletal muscle. One is that out of the three types of muscle, this is the only muscle tissue that you have conscious control over. Okay, when I say conscious, I mean voluntary. Okay, you can voluntarily control skeletal muscle. All right, obviously right now I'm talking to you and I'm thinking about what I'm going to say. Not all the time. Sometimes my mouth works faster than my head. Okay, but I'm thinking about what I want to say. I'm planning these actions in my brain, and I'm controlling the words coming out of my mouth. I'm controlling the pitch and tone of my voice. Okay, I mean, I walk around a lot when I lecture. I use hand gestures. Okay, I play sports. All right, I control those actions when I play sports. When I'm playing table tennis and I'm out there swinging away, and I want to do a forehand or a backhand, I control that action. Okay. So bear in mind that skeletal muscle is conscious. You have voluntary control over it. All right. And when you want to look at the histologic differences between skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle, the cells of skeletal muscle are very long and they're very cylindrical. Okay, they're very long and very cylindrical. Now, before I mentioned that, in the previous chapter when I talked about, or previous video, when I was talking about muscles, I mentioned that muscles have a couple parts. They have a belly. Okay, they have a belly, then they've got tendinous attachments on each side, so they can attach to our skeleton. There's an origin, there's an insertion. Okay. Now, the muscle cells are located within the belly, the skeletal, the myocytes. Okay, the contractile units, the contractile functional cells of the muscle are located within the belly of a muscle. Because remember, tendons are dense, regular connective tissue. All right. Now, these two tissues work together to generate movement. Now, one thing you have to keep in mind that when we said these cells are long, all right, you can see the cylindrical shape here. But when I say these cells are long, they're the entire length of the belly of that muscle. Okay, so for example, your sartorius muscle in your thigh, all right, that's a muscle that goes from the upper part of your hip all the way down, a hair below your knee, all right? And the belly of that muscle could be up to 12 inches long. All right, so what we're saying here is that your sartorius muscle, if your sartorius muscle is 12 inches long, then the cells are also going to be 12 inches long. All right, these are very long cells. All right, so they're long and they're cylindrical. They are unbranched. Okay, these cells do not branch out. So you just have a nice cylindrical cell traveling the entire length of the belly of that muscle. All right. Skeletal muscle tissue, the skeletal muscle cells are striated. That's an important characteristic to remember. We're going to come back to that when we talk about the physiology of a muscle contraction. All right, but when we say that this tissue is striated, what we're saying here is that you see alternating kind of lighter and darker patterns. Okay, you see alternating light and dark patterns. Okay, I'm not going to draw it down I'll do it the entire length. All right, and basically these patterns come from the contractile proteins that you find within the muscle cells. All right, there are two major proteins that is talked about when learning about this: actin and myosin. Okay. Actin is what we would call a thin filament or a thin protein. Myosin is what we would call a thick protein, okay, or a thick filament. All right. So basically, when you look at these light and dark patterns of a skeletal muscle, and you see the darker regions, okay, the darker striations, you're looking at an area where there is more myosin. All right, when you're looking at it at the more thinner colored areas, okay, the more thinly dark areas, that's where there is more actin, okay. But the presence of those proteins will give a different shade. All right, and also not just their presence, but also how they're organized. Okay, they're organized into contractile units called sarcomeres, but I don't really want to talk about the sarcomere now. All right, I'll talk about that later on. All right, but remember that word, striated, alternating light and dark patterns. Okay, alternating light and dark patterns. All right. Now, the nucleus. Now, the nucleus. Now, the skeletal muscles are multinucleated. Meaning they have more than one. Okay, so when you're looking at skeletal muscle cells under the microscope, the nuclei are also very peripheral. All right, so the nuclei are very peripheral. All right, and essentially, that's as a result of embryonic development, because skeletal muscle cells are derivatives of what are called satellite cells. Okay, and essentially what you're looking at whenever you see a nucleus, basically you're looking at that used to be an individual satellite cell. That used to be an individual satellite cell. So basically what a skeletal muscle cell is, it's a long cylindrical cell, and during embryonic development, a bunch of satellite cells fuse together to form this one long contractile unit we have in us today. Okay, so that's why they're multinucleated, because skeletal muscle is a derivative of smaller individual cells. All right. And, you have to bear in mind that there is some space in between skeletal muscle. All right, there is less space than there is between cardiac muscle cells, but there's more space in between skeletal muscle than there is in smooth muscle. So it's kind of in the middle when you want to talk about the spacing in between muscle cells or muscle tissues. All right, so when you're thinking about this, remember these very important characteristics. All right, the skeletal muscle cells are long and cylindrical. Like I said, they're the entire length of the belly of the muscle. They're unbranched. They are striated. You will see alternating light and dark patterns. Multinucleated, and there is some space in between the cells. And as you can see in this image here, this kind of brings all of this to life. All right. Now, another thing about skeletal muscle is that it's typically very neatly organized. All right, so the cells run in a very parallel-like fashion. Okay, they run in a very parallel fashion. All right, a lot of people like to describe skeletal muscle as being organized like a rope. Okay, or I don't know, I use the analogy sometimes of Twizzlers pull and peel licorice. All right, except for skeletal muscle's not twisted all right. Now, you can see here, you can see the nuclei. You can see that, there are multiple nuclei within each cell. All right. And again, they're on the periphery of the cell, which you can see here as well. All right. and you can see that it looks like there are light and dark patterns, okay, along here. These are these striations that you're noticing. These are the contractile proteins of the cell. All right, so basically what's going to happen when the muscle is stimulated to contract, these proteins are going to pull on one another, and then these cells are going to, these long cylindrical cells are going to get pulled kind of towards the center of the belly, and what's going to happen in a contracted muscle, these cells would be shorter, all right, versus a relaxed muscle. All right, so like I said right here, you're kind of taking a look at what, the tricep muscle group in this image, and like I said, the cells are the entire length of that belly of the muscle, okay? And then you can see there's a little bit of space. Now this space that's in between these muscle cells is occupied by areolar connective tissue. Remember that glue, that very widely spaced gluey tissue that I talked about. And within that areolar connective tissue, okay, within that areolar connective tissue, that's where you're going to find nerves and blood vessels, okay, to innervate and supply the nerves with the muscle with what it needs. Now, bringing that up and bringing nerves up as well, I mentioned before that we have voluntary conscious control over good Lord, over skeletal muscle tissue. Now, one thing about skeletal muscle, though, is that yes, we can consciously control it. In order for a skeletal muscle to contract, it needs to be innervated. Okay, when I say innervate, I'm talking about a nerve that is going to a specific tissue, a nerve that is associated with a specific tissue, all right? So there are what are called motor nerves that innervate skeletal muscle, all right? So this muscle just won't contract all on its own. It needs a nerve branching out from your central nervous system, releasing a neurotransmitter, and exciting, irritating this tissue, all right? And then it'll contract, all right? A good way to illustrate this is to think about what happens when you lose the ability of a motor neuron to stimulate a muscle to contract. You guys are familiar with paralysis, all right? When someone has a spinal cord injury that's severe enough, all right, let's say they have a lower back spinal cord injury and they're paralyzed in the waist down, they lose function of their legs, all right, and they lose the use of their leg muscles because those nerves have become damaged, and they cannot get those nerves cannot get impulses from the brain down to the muscles of the legs. You cannot use those muscles anymore, all right. So bear in mind that yes, we do have conscious control, but as a result, because we are planning the movements in our brain, we need a nerve going from our central nervous system out to these muscles to get them to work. All right, if you lose that connection, you lose the ability to use those muscles. All right, and then here are some more images of the skeletal muscle. Here you can see this is what's called the motor end plate. Okay, so this is a motor neuron that is branching out to various skeletal muscle cells or myocytes, and this is this nerve is going to release a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, and that stimulates it to contract. All right. And again, you can see the patterns, you can see the striations here. Okay, you can see the striations within the skeletal muscle. You can see there's a little bit of space that's, again, occupied by areolar connective tissue. And again, you can see the long cylindrical nature of these skeletal muscle cells. All right, and then as we go over here, this picture is just really cool, I think. You can see the skeletal muscle vascularization, meaning the blood vessels that are supplying the nerve with blood. All right, and again, the space that the space of these blood vessels are traveling in, is a result of areolar connective tissue. Okay, areolar connective tissue. All right, so, and then again, notice these striations, the long cylindrical nature of these muscle cells. All right, and then here again, this picture is also really cool because again, I know this is getting redundant. The long cylindrical nature, the striations, and then here the myotendinous junction. You can see where these muscles end, and then all of this here would be the dense, regular connective tissue. So basically, this is an area of very densely packed collagen fibers. So now, when this muscle contracts and the cells shorten, okay, the cells become shorter, then that's going to pull on this tendon, that's going to pull on a bone, and then movement can take place. So remember before I mentioned that the muscle cells are as long as the belly of the muscle. This right here is the end of the belly of the muscle. All right, so that's where the end of, so that's basically the end of that skeletal muscle cell, and then now you have this tendinous tissue, this dense regular CT. All right, it's really cool. All right, and again, there's more images on this website below, so again, I encourage you to take a look at that. So that's skeletal muscle tissue. All right, it's multinucleated, long cylindrical cells, it's striated, we have conscious control over it, and there's a little bit of space occupied by areolar connective tissue within it. All right, and then next I want to talk a little about cardiac muscle. And again, I'm not going to go terribly in depth with cardiac muscle because again, when we get to the heart, I'll talk more about cardiac about the physiology of the heart. But it's important to understand these basic characteristics of the histology of cardiac muscle. You know, one, you know, this is unconscious. Okay, when I say unconscious, this is involuntary tissue, involuntary. Lord, all right. So when I say this is involuntary tissue, we do not have conscious control over it, okay? So this is tissue that is constantly working, constantly contracting, all right, all the time, all right, without our conscious control. Your brain regulates the activity of the heart unconsciously, all right? Now, in saying that, and then I'll take that, and I want to say that cardiac muscle cells, you know, the one major similarity between cardiac and skeletal muscle is that they are both striated. Okay, I mentioned before the contractile proteins actin and myosin. Okay, and then when you organize them in a certain arrangement, you form what's called a sarcomere, the contractile unit of the muscle. The sarcomere of skeletal and cardiac muscles are basically identical. Okay, so they use the same contractile proteins, the same contractile units to do their jobs. Okay, again, so a big difference then is the length of the cell. Okay, cardiac muscle cells are very short, and they're also branched. So it's kind of a general representation of a cardiac muscle cell. All right, so they're short and branched. Now, they also have only one nucleus. They're not like a skeletal muscle cell that are multinucleated. Okay, that's what I mean when I say uninucleate. All right, and then you'll see they will be attached or organized like so. All right, then you would see them arranged like so. Then you have a nucleus there. All right, but bear in mind that these have those alternating patterns that I talked about as well. This is, would look like that throughout the entire cardiac muscle cell. Okay. Now, in between each cardiac muscle cell, there are structures that are called intercalated discs. Intercalated discs, okay? And these intercalated discs have a few important functions or properties to them, all right? And it has to do with their composition, okay? One, these intercalated discs contain proteins basically called desmosomes, okay, or hemidesmosomes to be specific, all right? Now, what these are anchoring tissues, okay? Because all of these, because all the cardiac muscle cells are connected to form one big unit, all right, when these tissues contract, they're generating a lot of force, all right? So these anchoring proteins basically prevent the cardiac muscle cells from separating from one another, all right? And then you've got another type of a protein in there. They're more like a gate called a gap junction. Okay, and basically what these allow for the transfer of an electrical signal, a membrane, an action potential, from cell to cell to cell. So since all the cells of cardiac muscle are eventually joined together to form one continuous sheet or unit of muscle tissue, all right, when one muscle cell contracts, okay, all of them are eventually going to follow. Okay, so keep that in mind. And when we take a look at the cardiac muscle tissue, you can see all these properties, these characteristics here. All right, you can see that the cells are very short, that the cells are branched, that the cells, you can see the striations within here. These dark lines here, those are the intercalated discs that I mentioned. All right, you can see the individual nucleus of the cell. All right, so again, there are similar properties, but there are also very different characteristics of this tissue. Then right here, they have this highlighted. You would find this cardiac muscle, this area that's highlighted in this picture, that's what's called the myocardium. Okay, cardiac muscle is within the myocardium of the heart. This is the actual contractile working tissue of cardiac muscle. All right, and then as we kind of go and take a look at this a little more in depth, again, you can see that there's a lot of space. You notice there's a lot more space in between this cardiac muscle tissue as compared to skeletal muscle tissue, but you can still see the individual nucleus. You can see the striations in this image here. Then as we move on, you can, again, take a look at the wide spacing. You can see the branching nature of the cells. All right, these lines here, those are the intercalated discs. Okay. And again, just another sheet, another sample of cardiac muscle tissue. Again, the intercalated discs, the branching nature of the cells, the individual nuclei per cell, the wide spacing. I mean, again, it's redundant, but that's how you learn histology, is you just have to look at different pictures of the same tissues to see these characteristics I'm talking about. Okay, and again, there are more images of this on the website. Check it out. Okay, but that's cardiac muscle tissue. And then last, the other type of muscle tissue that I want to discuss is smooth muscle. Okay, smooth muscle is comprised of short fusiform cells, and smooth muscle is also involuntary, unconscious. Okay, so we have unconscious control over smooth muscle. You don't sit there and say, boy, let's see, I stood up, so I need to make the arteries of my leg constrict so I can, so my blood pressure doesn't drop. You just automatically do that. Okay, there's your nervous system and your cardiovascular system work together to keep you alive. All right, but that's all done unconsciously. All right, now, smooth muscle is made up of these fusiform cells. Fusiform cells are long and cylindrical. They tend to have a longer nucleus, and you find these stacked together. Okay, so you find smooth muscle found as sheets. Okay, and you find smooth muscle essentially lining hollow organs of the body. Okay, hollow organs of the body, like blood vessels. Okay, whether you're talking about arteries or veins. Okay, arteries or veins, you find sheets of smooth muscle within them. Okay, your organs of the alimentary canal. Okay, when I say the alimentary canal, I mean your GI tract, the main organs of the digestive system. So your esophagus, your stomach, your small intestine, your colon, your rectum, and so on. Okay, smooth muscle lines the urinary bladder. So you got your urinary bladder, all right, you've got your urethra, and then there's a sheet of smooth muscle called the detrusor muscle. Okay, that lines the kind of the middle aspect of that. And when your bladder gets full, that muscle contracts, it shortens. All right, and then the size of your bladder gets smaller, and then you push urine out. All right. So again, anywhere where there's a hollow organ that has motility to it, you will find smooth muscle. All right, and that's why I put, down here, it's used for visceral motility. Now, smooth muscle, the reason why we call it smooth muscle is because it's non-striated. Okay, it does have the contractile proteins that I did mention, but it's arranged much, it's arranged much differently than you find in skeletal and cardiac muscle. And when we get to the chapter on muscle tissue, I'll talk more about the arrangements of the contractile units. But here are just a few examples of this. You see smooth muscle here. Again, you can see these kind of long fusiform shaped cells, and you can see the smooth muscle is, these smooth muscle cells are packed on top of one another. Like I said, you find this in sheets all over the body, right, within these hollow organs. And depending on the organ you're talking about, the layers may be very thin or they may be very thick. All right. And now the activity of the smooth muscle is also regulated by the nervous system, but regulated by what's called the autonomic nervous system. All right, your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. All right, and I will talk again more about that later on. But for example, if we look at an artery and a vein, okay, this right here is called the tunica media, the middle layer of tissue. All right, and this is an artery because arteries have much thicker walls of muscle. All right, this would be a vein. Okay, veins have much thinner layers of muscle. All right, and then what's all this around here? What's all this tissue? What type of tissue is that? We talked about that already. That would be what looks like these don't look like perfect ping pong balls, but this would be adipose tissue. Okay, so these are arteries and veins that are surrounded by adipose tissue. All right, so keep that in mind about these different types of muscle tissue. That again, when it comes to understanding the differences between them, you have to really pay attention to the again, I mean, with everything, the histologic characteristics. Look for, are there striations? Okay, are there alternating light and dark patterns? Look for the length and the size of the cells, the amount of space in between them. Again, skeletal muscle cells are very long. Cardiac muscle cells are very short. Okay, skeletal muscle cells are unbranched. Cardiac muscle cells are. Okay, smooth muscle cells are non-striated. Okay, they look very smooth in appearance underneath the microscope. All right. So keep that in mind when you're talking about the differences between these and when you're thinking about the functions of these. All right. And that's about all. Like I said, this is a little shorter, but that's about all I really want to say about these nervous and muscle tissue, just because we're going to go much more in depth with these later on. And if you have any questions, again, I can't say this enough, don't hesitate to contact me.